of understanding its place in history?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on. I mean, I think at least since the anti-Vietnam era, the anti-nuclear era really took hold in the late '70s. So, in many regards, I think it was the most successful movement that it existed in the last whatever that is, 45 years. The In going back and looking at some of the real early civil disobedience protests, the Clamshell Alliance, I think it was formed in 1977 to fight plants development in New Hampshire. In California, the Abalone Alliance was formed to fight Diablo Canyon. And Diablo Canyon, of course, did end up going online. However, after Diablo Canyon, there was no more nuclear power produced in California, and that was largely because of the direct action that these activists took. Um, and of course, then things got after 3 Mile Island. Things really just exploded all across the country, and then we had Chernobyl, and then after Chernobyl, um, there essentially was a mass movement against nuclear technology across the globe. But none of that's really would have happened had it not been for those early activists that were taking on and concerned about the nuclear power industry. And then, of course, that ended up linking up in the '80s when there was a increase in nuclear weapons production. That the anti-nukes joined forces, anti-nuclear power joined forces with the anti-nuclear um, weapons, and they were largely successful at stopping all kinds of plants from being developed all over the country. They were largely responsible for trying to end nuclear proliferation, which arguably they weren't as successful at that. But yeah, I think it's important to, from a left perspective, I look at the history of these social movements, and the left shouldn't be trying to tear them down. I think that we should be trying to build upon their successes. And it is really disheartening to look at some on the left that perhaps don't understand the victories that have come before them, but and some that do want to destroy it and think that they were wrong for moving forward. And I've heard arguments say, well, they if they wouldn't have opposed all these nuclear power plants, we wouldn't have coal production. They'll throw these kind of arguments around, and they're ridiculous arguments because coal was always cheap. Coal was king long before nuclear, and it was king for a reason because it's really inexpensive. Nuclear is very expensive, and globally, a lot of countries simply would never going to afford to go nuclear. That's why India and Vietnam and China. That's why they all were producing, have coal plants. There's these arguments are ridiculous. But can you imagine if we would have had more nuclear plants and the risk for more accidents in this country? I mean, we've already had all kinds of accidents in the short amount of time that nuclear plants have been operating in the world. And some of them were, quite a few instances where nuclear accidents were narrowly avoided. And I write about some of that in Atomic Days as well.
Exactly. And my point in bringing that up, just as you say, Josh, is to point out that, you know, the activists who were engaged in this work in the late 70s and into the 1980s, they understood far better than many of these people on the left today, how intertwined these things were. That an environmentalist perspective was an anti war perspective, it was a pro peace, an anti World War III perspective, that these things were so intimately linked as to essentially be activism on both issues simultaneously. And I think that today we oftentimes find that people have an extremely myopic view where these issues are all atomized, they're not connected to each other, they exist independent of each other, and here's the nuclear energy guy and over here is the peace guy and over here, but these things are connected, aren't they?
Yeah, they're absolutely connected. And I think this conversation changes a lot if tomorrow there is a meltdown or something horrific happens at Zaporizhia in Ukraine. if if it gets shelled, if somehow the backup generators fail. I nervously look every day to see what the latest information is coming out, and it seems like it's offline, it's online, it's offline again. There's information, then there's not information. I think the most recent thing today was that Russia is giving the Ukrainian workers at the facility an ultimatum: either you're for us or you have to leave. So it's a frightening scenario, and it's the first time that a nuclear plant has been in a war zone. Of course, the United States has targeted early development of plants, but not an operating plant like this has never been in the line of fire, and it's a really frightening development. And I think a new phase in warfare. I mean, Taiwan has a few nuclear plants. What if Taiwan becomes the next battleground? What's going to happen there? I mean, I think this conversation would change dramatically if there was a meltdown at Zaporizhia, and I think a lot. And I, of course, I'm very fearful of that. Um, but I think people need to be cautious about what when they're talking about promoting nuclear technology of what that really does mean for a lot of people.
Yeah, and of course, it's not like climate change could potentially pose a threat to these plants, right? It's not like Fukushima was devastated by a natural event.
Right. Yeah, I think if you look, I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but the UN has come out with some projections of what it would look like, what the risk of an accident is at a nuclear facility, and it's something like 1 in 1,000. But when you look at actually the accidents that have happened, a facility has a chance of an accident like 1 in 50. So it's that's in my book, that's just far too great. You don't see these kind of risks would not pose. Even the most polluting of energy plants don't pose these kind of risks in a war zone. A solar plant certainly doesn't. A coal plant doesn't. Even natural gas doesn't. Yeah, they would cause problems, but nothing like a nuclear meltdown. And if something were to happen at the plant in Ukraine, it's also not just going to impact Ukraine. Depending on the the winds, it could impact a large portion of Russia as well, which of course Putin knows. So yeah, it's a very dangerous situation, and I do not think it should be taken lightly.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking just what was it, 5 years ago was Hurricane Harvey in Houston. I mean, all of that rain that then flooded those fertilizer plants and those chemical plants that then dumped all of that like toxic sludge that basically, polluted the entire city until it was cleaned up. I mean, these kind of things with catastrophic Category 5 hurricanes basically every year moving forward. I mean, I can only imagine just the limitless possibilities for disaster that would await.
Well, and look at in my home state now, Diablo is up and running, and it's going to be extended. Its life is going to be extended because of Governor Newsom and the state legislature. Even though it had been agreed upon 5 years ago or whatever to shutter it, and that had been negotiations by PG&E and unions and the environmentalists. Yet here Governor Newsom comes along and says we got to keep this thing up and running. And at the time that it was agreed to be shuttered, there had been a really large study done that showed that replacing the energy produced from Diablo would cost about $5 billion less than it would cost to just keep the thing running. This doesn't even talk about the fact that Diablo sits on a fault line, what on the coast. I mean, there is absolutely no reason to keep it up and running. It poses a great risk. It's costing us a lot of money. And I guess it just shows that the Democrats certainly are not on our side when it comes to nuclear power.
Well, although we've spent a lot of time talking about fairly depressing information, I do like to try when we're talking about these kind of subjects to focus on something constructive. So, Josh, talk to me a little bit in the couple of minutes that we have remaining about what activism is going on this front these days. I mean, we talked about the anti-nuke movement of several decades ago, but I know that there's all kinds of direct action activism going on now. We've had guests on this show in the not too in the recent past who talked about direct action to stop fracking development, to stop pipeline development, Keystone and the Dakota and so forth. So, what about nuclear development? What about nuclear issues? I know there's been activists with direct action with regard to the mining on sacred lands in New Mexico. So tell us a little bit about what's going on there and give us something hopeful.
Yeah, I think with all of this nuclear talk that's happening, as that a lot of, I think, the younger generation hasn't experienced. You and I grew up during the Cold War. I think we both were aware of the threats of nuclear weapons, and now those threats are being tossed around again. And it's really important that I think people get active. Um, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICAN, is very active in trying to fight to ban nuclear weapons across the globe, and reduce proliferation. At the local level, a lot of communities are fighting against nuclear technologies. In a place like Hanford, which I focused on, obviously, there are a number of groups that are working on the issue. The Columbia Riverkeeper is working on the Hanford issue. Hanford Challenge, which is in Seattle, is working on the issue. These small organizations really do need a lot of support. At the local level, I think it's really important for people to uh, look at what their Congress people and what they're supporting. What kind of money are they pouring into weapons development? Are they supporting the war in Ukraine, for example? And what does that look like? What does the language even look like when it comes to nuclear power? A lot of these politicians have no idea that the kind of risk that nuclear power pose. So I think it's really important for people to get active at the local level, and from an environmental standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint, because we should be pouring our money and our research into technologies that already exist to solve the climate problem, not ones that we know cost a bunch of money and have failed in the past. Um, so I want to be more hopeful. I wish I could, Eric. But you can't have hope unless there's action, and we need more action. And Counterpunch knows that. Our readers know that. Our listeners know that. Um, but a lot of others don't. And things aren't going to change unless we get active.
What'd they say back in the 80s? Get active or get radioactive.
I like that's a good saying, and I think we might have to bring it back.
There's a Counterpunch t shirt. That's the next one. Get
That is.
active or get radioactive with the little CP logo
Oh,
on
I
it.
love it. I love it. Well, speaking of ways to support Counterpunch, we do have some really great T-shirts. We do have a No Nukes T-shirt that's in the mix right now. If they go to the store, people can pick that up, and it helps support the work that we do, and a lot of the writers that we publish. We publish a ton of investigative stuff of what Fukushima, all the way to what's happening in Ukraine, and the problems that nuclear proliferation poses to the entire world.
The book is Atomic Days, The Untold Story of the Most Toxic Place in America. The author is Johsua Frank, co editor of Counterpunch. Great guy, great author. Go get yourself a copy of the book. Maybe go over to your local independent bookstore and see if you could get them to order it for you and maybe carry it in that store as well. Anything to avoid Amazon if possible. But Joshua, thank you as always for coming and chatting with us. Thank you for this great book. So important and so timely with all of these debates on the left. So thanks for that.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Listeners, thank you as always for the continued support. Go over to Counterpunch, get in on the fund drive. We really appreciate it. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.